In the idyllic suburbs of Maplewood, the Carson family was the epitome of success and happiness. James Carson, a charismatic businessman in his early 40s, was well respected in the community for his leadership and dedication to his family. His wife, Claire, elegant and compassionate, had been his partner in life and love for the past 15 years. Together, they seemed to have it all: a beautiful home, 2 loving children, and a life most could only dream of. Adding to this perfect image was Claire's niece, Emily. At just 22, Emily was a bright, attractive young woman who had recently moved in with the Carsons to attend the local university. She was looking for a fresh start after a turbulent few years with her family, and Claire had been more than willing to provide her with a stable environment. Claire, who saw Emily as the daughter she never had, welcomed her with open arms, grateful for the chance to help. Emily quickly became part of the family's daily life, seamlessly integrating herself into their routines. She helped with dinner, played with the children, and accompanied the family on outings. Her presence seemed to breathe new life into the household, and everyone, especially James, appeared to enjoy her company. To outsiders, the Carsons were thriving, the perfect family unit with an added member who only made them stronger. But behind the scenes, not everything was as it seemed. Claire, engrossed in her responsibilities as a mother and wife, was blissfully unaware of the undercurrents that flowed through her home. She trusted James implicitly, never questioning his devotion or the way his eyes lingered a little too long on Emily. She was blind to the furtive glances exchanged between her husband and niece, to the barely noticeable tension that simmered just beneath the surface. James, for his part, was struggling with desires he couldn't control. Outwardly, he was the perfect husband and father, but inwardly he was torn. Emily's youth and vivacity captivated him in a way he hadn't felt in years. It started innocently enough, compliments on her achievements, friendly conversations over dinner. But as the weeks passed, those small gestures began to take on a life of their own, evolving into something darker and more dangerous. Emily, too, found herself drawn to James in a way she couldn't quite understand. At first, she chalked it up to admiration. After all, James was everything her own father had never been: successful, attentive, and charming. But as the days turned into weeks, her feelings grew more complex, and she found herself eagerly anticipating their brief moments alone. She knew it was wrong, but she couldn't help the thrill that ran through her whenever he smiled at her in that way. The tension in the house was palpable, though Claire remained oblivious, lost in the comfort of her seemingly perfect life. She had no idea that the very foundations of her world were beginning to crack, that the people she loved most were teetering on the edge of a precipice. The illusion of family unity was strong, but it was only a matter of time before the cracks widened and the facade came crashing down. As the warm days of summer turned into the crisp chill of autumn, the connection between James and Emily grew stronger, and the boundaries that should have kept them apart began to blur. It started with late-night conversations in the kitchen after everyone else had gone to bed. They talked about everything and nothing: Emily's struggles at university, James's work pressures, and their shared love for classic films. Each conversation drew them closer, creating a bond that was becoming dangerously intimate. James found himself looking forward to these moments more than he cared to admit. The excitement he felt when he heard Emily's soft footsteps approaching the kitchen was something he hadn't felt in years. He tried to convince himself that there was nothing wrong with their interactions, that he was just being a supportive uncle. But deep down, he knew the truth. He was playing with fire, and he didn't want to stop. Emily, for her part, was equally conflicted. Her feelings for James had grown beyond admiration, turning into something she didn't want to name. He made her feel special, seen in a way she hadn't been in a long time. The compliments he gave her, the way he listened to her, made her heart race. She knew it was wrong, knew she was betraying Claire, but the pull of her emotions was too strong to resist. The first kiss happened one late evening in the dimly lit kitchen. They were standing close, their laughter fading into a charged silence. James reached out, brushing a stray lock of hair from Emily's face. Their eyes locked, and for a moment, time seemed to stand still. Before either of them could think, he leaned in and their lips met. It was a soft, hesitant kiss, filled with unspoken promises and the thrill of the forbidden. When they pulled apart, both were breathless, stunned by what they had done. 1,000 thoughts raced through Emily's mind: guilt, fear, and a strange exhilaration. But in that moment, all she could focus on was the way James was looking at her, his eyes dark with desire. "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice thick with regret and longing. "I shouldn't have—" But Emily shook her head, silencing him with a finger to his lips. "Don't be," she said softly, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew she should walk away, put an end to this madness before it spiraled out of control. But instead she leaned in and kissed him again, this time with more urgency. From that night on, there was no turning back. What had begun as a spark now erupted into a full-blown affair, fueled by stolen moments and whispered confessions. They met in secret, stealing kisses in shadowed corners of the house and exchanging heated glances across the dinner table when Claire wasn't looking. Every encounter was a risk, but the thrill of secrecy only heightened their attraction. Emily was caught in a whirlwind of emotions: guilt, passion, and the thrill of being desired. She knew she was playing a dangerous game, but she couldn't bring herself to stop. James, too, was trapped in his own web of lies and desires. He told himself he still loved Claire, that this affair was just a temporary madness, a separate part of his life that didn't affect his marriage. But as their secret meetings continued, he felt the walls closing in, the guilt gnawing at him. The perfect family image remained intact on the outside, but inside, the cracks were widening. Claire, still oblivious, trusted them both completely. She had no idea that the people she loved most were betraying her, that the life she had built was hanging by a thread. And as James and Emily continued their dangerous dance, they were hurtling towards a point of no return, where the truth would shatter everything. As the weeks passed, the tension in the Carson household grew palpable. James and Emily's affair, which had once seemed thrilling and dangerous, now felt like a ticking time bomb. Emily, once carefree and vibrant, was now a shadow of herself, burdened by the guilt of her betrayal. She avoided Claire at all costs, spending most of her time in her room or out of the house. Each time she saw her aunt, the weight of her deceit felt heavier, suffocating her. James, too, was unraveling. The guilt gnawed at him, but so did the fear of losing everything he had built. Every time he looked at Claire, he saw the woman he had vowed to love and protect, now blissfully unaware of the storm brewing behind her back. He knew he should end things with Emily, but the thought of losing her was unbearable. He was caught in a web of his own making, and every move he made only seemed to tangle him further. One evening, as the first chill of autumn settled over Maplewood, Claire noticed Emily's unusual behavior. Her niece, who had once been so eager to help with dinner and spend time with the family, was now distant, her eyes clouded with something Claire couldn't quite place. Worry gnawed at her. She had always prided herself on being in tune with her family's emotions, but this time she felt lost. "Emily, is everything all right?" Claire asked gently as they stood in the kitchen, her voice filled with concern. Emily looked up, her eyes wide with panic. "Yeah, Aunt Claire, just a lot going on with school," she replied, her voice shaky and unconvincing. Claire frowned, sensing there was more to the story, but she didn't want to push too hard. Instead, she reached out, placing a comforting hand on Emily's shoulder. "You know you can talk to me about anything, right? Whatever it is, we can work through it together." Emily nodded, forcing a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "I know, Aunt Claire. Thanks." That night, unable to shake the feeling that something was wrong, Claire lay awake, her mind racing with possibilities. She thought about the little things she had noticed: Emily's nervousness around James, the hushed conversations that ended abruptly when she entered a room. A nagging suspicion began to form in the back of her mind, but she pushed it away, unable to believe that the people she loved most could betray her in such a way. Unable to sleep, she went downstairs to get a glass of water. As she passed by the living room, she saw the faint glow of James's phone on the coffee table. Normally, she would never think of invading his privacy, but a sense of dread gripped her heart. Almost without thinking, she picked up the phone and unlocked it. The messages she found in the hidden folder marked "Work" shattered her world. The exchanges between James and Emily were filled with flirtatious banter, inside jokes, and a familiarity that went far beyond what was appropriate. And then there were the photos, selfies of the two of them, their heads close together, smiling as if they had no care in the world. Claire's hands shook as she read through the messages, her mind struggling to process what she was seeing. The betrayal was so deep, so complete, that it felt like her heart was being ripped out of her chest. She wanted to scream, to throw the phone across the room, but she was paralyzed, her world crumbling around her. In the aftermath of her discovery, Claire felt as though she was living in a nightmare. Every time she looked at James, she saw the man who had betrayed her in the worst possible way. And every time she saw Emily, the pain of betrayal cut even deeper. The young woman she had welcomed into her home, whom she had loved and trusted like a daughter, had shattered her trust. That evening, unable to contain her emotions any longer, Claire confronted James. He was sitting on the couch, seemingly relaxed, but as soon as he saw the look on her face, his expression changed. "James," she began, her voice trembling but filled with determination. "We need to talk." He looked up, alarm flashing in his eyes, as he noticed the phone in her hand. "What is it, Claire?" "Don't you dare play dumb with me," she spat, her voice rising. "I know everything. I saw the messages. I saw the pictures." James's face paled as he realized the gravity of the situation. He opened his mouth to speak, but Claire cut him off, her voice shaking with anger and pain. "How could you do this to me?" she demanded, tears streaming down her face. "I loved you, I trusted you, and you betrayed me in the most unforgivable way." "Claire, please, I can explain," James stammered, but his words felt hollow even to him. "It's not what you think." "Not what I think," Claire interrupted, her voice filled with disbelief. "You've been having an affair with my niece under my own roof, and you have the audacity to tell me it's not what I think." Before James could respond, Emily appeared in the doorway, her face ashen. "Aunt Claire, Don't you dare!" Claire hissed, her eyes blazing with fury. "How could you do this to me, Emily? I took you in, gave you a home, treated you like my own daughter. And this is how you repay me?" Emily burst into tears, her body shaking with sobs. "I'm so sorry, Aunt Claire. I never wanted to hurt you. I didn't mean for any of this to happen." "Didn't mean for it to happen," Claire repeated, her voice filled with bitterness. "You knew exactly what you were doing, both of you. You've destroyed this family, and for what?" The room was charged with a heavy, unbearable tension. James stood there, frozen, caught between the two women he had betrayed, his mind spinning with panic and regret. Claire's tears, her pain, were like knives to his heart. He had never felt so ashamed, so utterly pathetic. "Claire, please." "I'm sorry," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I never meant to hurt you. I love you. I love our family." "Love," Claire spat, her voice filled with contempt. "You call this love? You've destroyed everything we had, everything we built together." Emily sobbed uncontrollably, her body trembling with grief and guilt. Claire turned to her, her eyes filled with a mixture of rage and sorrow. "I can't believe I ever trusted you." With that, she turned and walked out of the room, leaving James and Emily standing in stunned silence. The sound of the door slamming echoed through the house, a final, devastating punctuation to the confrontation. The days following the confrontation were a blur of grief and despair. Claire, unable to bear the sight of James and Emily, locked herself away in the guest bedroom, refusing to speak to either of them. She felt as though her world had been torn apart, and she was left alone to pick up the pieces. James, consumed by guilt and regret, tried desperately to reach out to her. He left messages, sent flowers, tried to explain, but every attempt was met with silence. He knew he had made a terrible mistake, but he didn't know how to fix it, or if it was even possible to fix. Emily, too, was struggling. The affair that once seemed so thrilling had turned into a nightmare. She couldn't escape the guilt that gnawed at her, couldn't shake the image of her aunt's tearful, heartbroken face. She had betrayed the one person who had given her everything, and she knew she could never make it right. One evening, after days of isolation, Claire emerged from the guest bedroom. Her face was pale, her eyes red and swollen from crying. She walked into the living room where James and Emily were sitting in a tense, uneasy silence. "I can't stay here anymore," Claire said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I can't live under the same roof as you two." James stood up, his heart pounding in his chest. "Claire, please, we can fix this. We can get through this." "Fix this?" Claire interrupted, her voice trembling with anger. "You really think we can fix this, James? You've destroyed our family. You've destroyed me." Emily sobbed quietly, her head bowed in shame. Claire turned to her, her eyes filled with a cold, unforgiving fury. "And you? I took you in, treated you like my own daughter, and this is how you repay me?" "I'm so sorry," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. "I never wanted to hurt you. I was stupid and selfish, and I—" "Save it," Claire cut her off, her voice icy. "I don't want to hear your excuses. I don't want to hear anything from either of you." She took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. "I'm leaving tonight, and I'm not coming back." James felt a wave of panic wash over him. "Claire, please, don't do this. We can work this out. We can—" "There's nothing left to work out," Claire said, her voice hollow. "You've taken everything from me." With that, she turned and walked out of the room, her footsteps echoing through the silent house. James and Emily watched her go, their hearts heavy with the unbearable weight of what they had done. After Claire's departure, the house felt empty, haunted by the ghost of the family they had once been. James and Emily, consumed by guilt and despair, barely spoke to each other. They were like strangers, bound together only by the terrible secret they shared. James tried to reach out to Claire, but she ignored his calls, his messages. He drove to her sister's house where she was staying, but she refused to see him. The realization that he might have lost her forever was like a punch to the gut, leaving him gasping for air. Emily, too, was struggling to cope with the aftermath of their affair. She had lost everything, her family, her sense of self. She couldn't sleep, couldn't eat, her mind consumed by the image of her aunt's devastated face. She had destroyed the only person who had ever truly cared for her, and she didn't know how to live with that. One night, unable to bear the silence any longer, James turned to Emily. "We need to talk." Emily looked up, her eyes red and swollen. "What is there to talk about?" James sighed, running a hand through his hair. "We can't go on like this. We need to figure out what we're going to do." "What we're going to do?" Emily repeated, her voice filled with bitterness. "There's nothing left to do, James. We've destroyed everything." James flinched at her words, the truth of them hitting him like a physical blow. He knew she was right. They had ruined everything, and there was no way to fix it. "I'm so sorry, Emily," he whispered, his voice filled with despair. "I never meant for any of this to happen." Emily looked at him, her eyes filled with pain. "I know, but it did happen, and now we have to live with it." The silence between them was heavy, filled with unspoken regrets and shattered dreams. James wanted to reach out to her, to comfort her, but he knew it would be futile. They were both drowning, and there was no way to save each other. Then one morning, everything changed. The police arrived at their door with the news that Claire's car had been found abandoned on a remote road. In the passenger seat was a note, her final words etched in pain and betrayal. "James, you and Emily took everything from me. I can't live with this pain. I loved you, trusted you both, and you destroyed me." The words were like a knife to James's heart. He had driven the woman he loved to her death, and there was no redemption, no forgiveness. The realization of what he had done was too much to bear. He collapsed onto the floor, sobbing uncontrollably as the weight of his actions crushed him. Emily stood there, her body trembling with shock and grief. She felt as though she was trapped in a nightmare, unable to wake up. "Why?" James choked out, his voice breaking. "Why did she do this?" But there was no answer, only the deafening silence of a life that had been destroyed. The drive to the police station was a blur for James and Emily, their hearts pounding with dread and disbelief. The detective's call had been brief and cold, urging them to come in as soon as possible, but revealing nothing more. As they sat in the back seat of the cab, the silence between them was suffocating. Each was lost in their own whirlwind of thoughts, their minds racing with worst-case scenarios. When they arrived at the station, Detective Reynolds met them with a grave expression, ushering them into a small, dimly lit room. The atmosphere was heavy with tension, and James felt a cold sweat break out across his forehead. Emily's hands trembled as she clutched her coat, her face pale and drawn. "Mr. Carson, Miss Thomas, "I'm afraid I have some difficult news," the detective began, his voice steady but filled with sympathy. He took a deep breath before continuing. "Claire Carson was found earlier this morning. I'm sorry to inform you that she's passed away." James felt the room spin around him, his heart dropping to his stomach. Emily let out a choked sob, her hand flying to her mouth as she struggled to process what she had just heard. The world seemed to tilt on its axis, everything becoming a blur of grief and disbelief. No, that can't be," James whispered, shaking his head in denial. "There must be some mistake. She can't be gone." The detective's eyes softened as he looked at them, the pain in their faces unmistakable. "I'm sorry, but there's no mistake. Claire's body was found in a remote area outside of town. It appears she took her own life." Emily's sobs grew louder, her body shaking uncontrollably as she buried her face in her hands. James felt as though the air had been sucked out of the room, leaving him gasping for breath. His mind reeled with the realization of what this meant. Claire was gone, and there was no coming back. "Why?" he choked out, his voice breaking. "Why would she do this?" Detective Reynolds hesitated before speaking, his tone gentle. "We found a note in her car. It seems she was deeply affected by the situation between the two of you. She felt betrayed, alone, and she didn't see a way forward." He handed James a sealed evidence bag containing a crumpled piece of paper. With trembling hands, James took it, his vision blurred by tears as he read the words Claire had left behind. "James, you and Emily took everything from me. I can't live with this pain. I loved you, trusted you both, and you destroyed me. I hope you're happy now. I hope it was worth it." The note slipped from his fingers as he buried his face in his hands, his body racked with sobs. Emily reached out to him, her own face streaked with tears, but he recoiled as if her touch burned him. "This is your fault," he whispered, his voice filled with rage and despair. "You did this. You destroyed her." Emily recoiled as though struck, her eyes wide with shock and pain. She opened her mouth to speak, to protest, but the words wouldn't come. She felt as though she were drowning, the weight of her guilt pulling her under. Detective Reynolds watched them with a sad, resigned expression. "I know this is incredibly hard, but we need to ask you both some questions about the events leading up to Claire's death. It's standard procedure, given the circumstances." James and Emily answered the questions in a daze, their voices hollow as they recounted the events of the past few weeks. The guilt, the betrayal, the lies, it all spilled out in a painful, disjointed confession. By the time they were allowed to leave, they felt like empty shells, drained of everything but their overwhelming grief. The drive back to the house was silent, the atmosphere thick with sorrow and regret. When they arrived, the house felt emptier than ever, haunted by the ghost of the life they had destroyed. James stood in the doorway, his eyes scanning the room as if expecting Claire to appear at any moment, to tell him this was all just a horrible dream. But the silence was deafening, and the reality of her absence was like a knife to his heart. Emily hesitated at the door, her eyes filled with fear and sorrow as she looked at James. She wanted to say something, anything, to ease the unbearable tension between them, but she knew there were no words that could make this right. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I'm so sorry." James turned to her, his eyes filled with a mixture of anger and despair. "Sorry?" he spat, his voice shaking with rage. "You think sorry is going to fix this? She's dead, Emily. She's dead, and it's because of us." Emily flinched, her heart breaking all over again as his words cut through her like a knife. She nodded, tears streaming down her face, and without another word, she turned and fled up the stairs, disappearing into the darkness of her room. James stood there for a moment, his body trembling with grief and anger. He wanted to scream, to break something, anything, to release the unbearable pain that was tearing him apart. But all he could do was collapse onto the couch, his body racked with sobs as the weight of his actions crushed him. He had destroyed everything, his marriage, his family, and the woman he had once promised to love and protect. And now all he had left was the hollow shell of the life they had built together, a painful reminder of the consequences of his betrayal. As the night stretched on, the house remained silent, the darkness pressing in around them like a suffocating shroud. And in that silence, the full extent of their loss settled over them, leaving James and Emily alone with their guilt, their grief, and the knowledge that they could never undo what had been done. Claire was gone, and they would have to live with that for the rest of their lives.